In this video, we're going to be going over the ultimate Season 7 Overwatch 2 tier list, where we're going to be ranking every single hero in every single role. So it's all going to be in one place, and every single thing is going to be timestamped, so you can easily jump around to the exact heroes that you want to know about in the current meta. On top of that, I'm going to be giving 2 ranks to every single hero, one for GM top 500 and one for average elo. So you keep that in mind when I'm placing these characters. Regardless of the rank you're in, you're gonna have the perfect tier list for you. Now, if you enjoy the new tier list style and you want to support the channel, do me a solid and press that like and subscribe. It goes a long way to helping support us and keeping us going. Last off, before we begin, I'm offering a coaching holiday special. $15 off for your coaching, and if you lock in, you will stay at that price permanently. So as long as you want to maintain coaching, you will have the discounted price every single month. And I highly suggest players that are bronze, silver, and gold to come aboard, because I will be picking one person and working with them consistently to try to get them as high in rank as possible, and be part of a series I'm making, Unranked to Grandmaster, where I coach a student all the way to the highest ranks of play. So if you want to get coaching at a discounted price and you want a chance to actually qualify to become part of the series that I'm making, definitely check it out right now in the links down below, and let's get started. Now, first off, we're definitely going to talk about tanks, because tanks make metas. They are the cornerstone of every single composition, and they are the most important building blocks for the rest of the roster. Basically, if you know what tanks are good, you could better understand what other characters are going to be good in the meta. And the first character that we definitely got to talk about is Orisa. And Orisa did receive slight nerfs to her Fortify, but overall, Orisa is still going to be the unkillable nightmare that she has been for quite some time. A very powerful character, but without the carry potential of a lot of other tanks, primarily due to the fact that your job as Orisa is a cooldown sponge. You're someone that can eat every single cooldown being thrown at you and basically just shrug it off, staying alive permanently, causing disruption, and being a very unstoppable source of space control. And overall, Orisa is still a phenomenal character, but I do think that because of how the meta has shifted, there are ways to counteract her in ways that we haven't seen before. There are other tanks like D.Va and Doomfist that, especially on high ground maps, absolutely outclass Orisa, because she can't control the high ground very easily, and you have to constantly be shifting between the high and low ground, which Orisa just can't do. And there are other characters like Sigma that on certain maps he's just heavily favored in, and if you're in a poke battle, you would much rather be playing him. So there's enough situations where Orisa isn't played to put her out of the S tier. I do think that she's still a very solid pick and very, very strong, but there are definitely ways to counteract her. There are definitely situations that she's not good in, and there's a lot of maps that don't favor her. Overall, I'm still going to put her in the A tier though, as a very solid pick in the meta. And keep in mind, this A tier placement sticks for both top 500, Grandmaster, and the average rank. So Orisa is always going to be A tier, and she's one of the few characters that I think have a very similar placement along all ranks. The next up, we do got to talk about Zarya. And Zarya is a character that did get a pretty big nerf, especially to her team bubble. And even though overall she's still relatively stronger than she was pre-buffs, she's not quite as strong as she was in the most recent patch that just happened. Now, that doesn't mean that this character is bad by any stretch of the imagination. She's still a very, very strong character, especially when we're talking about flat ground maps that don't have high ground centric areas. So she's going to be really weak on maps like New Bonnie, for instance, but she's actually going to be really strong on certain closer range maps, or maps that are primarily low ground centric maps, perhaps a map like King's Row, for instance. Now, that being said, Zarya is actually one of the best characters to potentially play in the lower ranks of play, and she was absolutely dominant when she was just off this most recent patch, and I still think that that dominance rings true in the patch currently in Season 7. So if we're talking about her specifically for the average ranked play, she's an S tier character, but if we're talking about her specifically for top 500 Grandmaster level, I think that you could justify her as a low A tier pick or a high B tier pick. I'm going to put her in the high B tier, but I do think that she's still a very strong character and not a character to be completely disregarded. The next up, we do got to talk about Ramattra, and Ramattra is a character that is really strong. He did receive some slight buffs to a cooldown reduction in his Nemesis form, and ultimately this character is very flexible. One of the things that's so great about this character, especially if you main him, is that he can be good in a number of different situations with a number of different compositions. You can play him as a brawl tank, and he's actually pretty good at brawling out characters that either don't want to brawl or brawling to be anti-dive, or maybe even fighting other brawl characters just straight up in the head-to-head if you have enough resources. In addition to that, he can transition his playstyle to a more poke-oriented playstyle, playing from far away and just trying to stay out of the effective range of characters that want to close in the gap. Combine all those things together with a very powerful ultimate, and Ramattra is just really strong most of the time. The only problem is one of his worst matchups is Orisa. Orisa's Javelin is very annoying to deal with. In addition to that, Doomfist, who's also seeing a fair amount of play, is also a frustrating matchup for Ramattra because he can just punch you away, and he does have some pretty bad matchups currently, even if objectively he's just a very flexible and strong character. I don't think he's underpowered in any way. It's really just about the meta that we're currently in. Now, if I'm still thinking about this character for the average rank of play, I think that flexibility is something that can't be understated. You could hard carry, you can play to your strengths, you can avoid your weaknesses, you can make him work, and I think that especially for the average rank, he's an A-tier character. But if we pivot over to Grandmaster top 500 level, he's actually going to fall down to the B tier. I'm putting him just under Zarya in the B tier. Still a solid character overall if you're really good with him, playing him in the right situation, but not as strong as he has been in other metas. In fact, the meta right before Orisa got Giga buffed, he was an S tier pick for sure at most ranks, but now he's fallen down the wayside. Too many characters that are too good at shutting him down for him to be one of the best characters in the game right now. The next up, we do got to talk about Junkerqueen, and Junkerqueen is in a slightly weird situation because unfortunately there are just too many other competitive options that Junkerqueen has kind of fallen out of favor. I think that if you're playing a very specific composition, you can get a lot of value with her. You know, you could play something that gets to enable her with speed boost, you get to engage really quickly, but there are also an entire world where you walk forward, you get naded, and you just can't do anything. You walk forward and get javelin, you feel useless, all your swings get bubbled, Doomfist is just keeping you at bay, a freaking Sigma is keeping you at range, a diva is never engaging you on your terms. There's just so many situations where I think Junkerqueen starts to fall down. Now, of course, if you are a god at Junkerqueen, you could make her work, especially in ranked play, and in coordinated play, it's a completely different thing. But I do think that for the majority of ranks in the majority of people's hands, Junkerqueen is not going to be that consistent or that good. There are going to be some situations where you can whip her out, but not that reliably. I'm actually going to put Junkerqueen in the C tier currently, but I think that this is mainly for players in Grandmaster 1 top 500. Perhaps if you get enough coordination at the highest ranks of play, you can make her work. C tier is actually still a fine rank. Keep in mind, it's still a character that's viable, but it's not a character that is defining any metas by any means. And honestly, I'm going to put her in the C tier as well for the majority or the average rank. I think you could maybe justify B tier. There's nothing really wrong with her. I just think that there are few situations where she's the objectively best tank to play. She's more of a person that you're going to play based on your personal preference, and there are a lot of situations where it's going to be really hard for you to get value on this character. So overall, I'm putting her in the C tier. Now, next up, we do got to talk about D.Va. And D.Va has remained one of the strongest characters in the game, one of the best characters to play as a diver, one of the best characters to play just in general. You have so much agency over your games. You can peel cooldowns, you can dive, you can deny. She's very flexible in her playstyle. She can have a lot of impact. But here's the thing that you need to understand about D.Va. She gets way better when you have people that are coordinating together. She gets way better as the lobby skill gets better, and she's a very hard character to play at the highest level. So there's a lot of things that are working against her. That means the average person cannot get the value out of D.Va that a normal Grandmaster level player or a top 500 level player would be able to get out. So at the Grandmaster top 500 level, I would say, especially if you consider the maps that she is like really good on, like the high ground oriented maps, I'd put her in the S tier for Grandmaster top 500. But if we're considering for the average rank play, I would move her down towards the bottom of B tier. I think she's still solid, but she doesn't get as much value on average as she does in the high ranks of play, in the average ranks of play. Now, next up, we do got to talk about Roadhog, and Roadhog's rework is kind of in the far distance. It will happen at some point, maybe next season, but we'll have to wait and see. And honestly, after Sombra's rework was actually pretty fun and made the character better, in my opinion, both to play with and play against, which of course we have an entire video coming out, so you should press that subscribe button to see that video where we break down exactly the Sombra experience, especially after the rework. I think that Hog could be a better character post rework. I'm really excited about it, but currently in the meta right now, Hog is basically unplayable. He's one of the worst characters in the game. I think he's probably one of, if not like the only few that deserve this rank out of every character we're reviewing today. He's just too easy to counter. Ana is also the most popular support. He's just way too easy to shut down with everything that's played. There are a million characters that can just completely deny what he's trying to do. Freaking Zarya bubble, Orisa javelin, Diva freaking DM. There's just so many things other tanks can do, other DPS can do, supports can do. He's an F tier. He's just an F tier. If you're getting value out of Hog, you're an absolute god. And I think the only time that he's not in the F tier is on a map like Well, where you can pull people in, but it's like so niche and cheeky that he overall deserves an F tier slot. So this is where he's gonna lay. And by the way, that F tier is for all ranks. Doesn't matter what rank you're in, he's in the F tier. Sorry. Next up, we do gotta talk about Sigma, and Sigma is going to be an S tier character, especially for GM Top 500, just because on all the long distance sniper maps, Havana, Circuit Royale, maps like that, Sigma's necessary. He's just absolutely necessary. He's the best tank to play. You should be playing him. You should learn Sigma just so that you can play him on those maps. He's pretty much necessary for a tank player to at least know, because if you don't know how to play anything else, and you're just gonna have a hugely negative win rate on those freaking maps. He's just needed, and that's kind of why he's in the S tier. But outside of that, he's pretty niche. So he has maps that are just like 100% needed and other maps, but that still makes him like a staple of the meta, right? If no matter what the meta is, there's gonna be certain maps that are just like, these are Sigma's maps, and these are the maps that you have to play Sigma on, or you should play Sigma on, and that's kind of where he's remained, and it's been that way in Top 500 GM, and it still should be that way in the average rank. So I'm still gonna put him in the S tier for both, because I think he's needed absolutely on those maps. And yeah, he's just a very, very solid character. And I also think that he's actually a bit better on some other maps in the low tiers of play, because Sigma just gives you a lot of agency. You get to take these crazy off angles, you have your own personal shield, you just get to threaten so much damage, your ultimate's good. I mean, there's just a lot about Sigma that's super, super strong regardless of the situation in lower tiers of play. So I'm gonna put him in the S tier. I could definitely see the argument for high tier A, but overall I just think he's too good on the maps that he's needed to play on, that you need to learn Sigma. You need to learn how to play Sigma on the maps he's good in. It's just gonna set you up for success. Next up, we do gotta talk about Winston, and Winston is in a spot where I actually think he's fairly solid in this season. I know it's a little bit strange, but especially because of the nerfs that have gone around here and there and some of the changes to the meta, dive is still a viable strategy, especially when we get to the higher ranks of play, and I think that that could be enabled by a Winston. So Winston is still a very, very strong diver, and I think that especially in the right hands, you can get a lot of value out of him. And with Sombra and Genji and Tracer and like Echo and some other divers, you could potentially play like a Phara, Mercy with a dive. Winston could get quite a bit of value on some of the high ground maps. I think I'm going to put him in the B tier. I'm going to put him between Ramattra and Zarya. I could see him being a little bit higher. And this is the rank that I'm going to put him for Grandmaster Top 500. But I'm actually putting him in the C tier when we're talking about the average rank. And this is for a couple of reasons. Number one, players are not very good at Winston, and this is kind of something that just kind of rings true, where people think that Winston is just this very simple character, but he's actually one of the hardest characters to properly push your limits, push your bounds, execute, get a lot of value without dying, and it's even harder to get value out of him when you don't have coordination, which is the second point. In low tiers of play, good luck having that coordination. You're just not going to have it. It's going to be very inconsistent. People are not on the same target at the same time, and I do think that if you have like a trio going on, then you could probably get him to work. As long as you're talking a lot, you're communicating, you're making him work, he could be back to that B tier. But for most of the time, I'm going to say he's a C tier character in the average rank, even if he is a B tier character in the higher ranks. Now we're going to talk about Hammond. Hammond did get some buffs. He did get some buffs, but still, they're not enough. I mean, Hammond is just relatively weak right now, unfortunately. I think he's actually the worst of all the dive tanks. I think out of Winston, Diva, and Doomfist, he's worse than all three. There are some pros to him. There are some pros in the fact that he's a little bit more independent. He combos better with hit scans in a dive. So unlike those other characters like Winston, his bubble and the way he engages, he wants to engage with the Sombra. He wants to engage with the Tracer. He wants to engage with the Genji. Ball can engage with an Ashe. Ball can engage with a Soldier. Ball can engage with a Sojourn, right? Because you're slamming and the line of sight, and you can kind of combine those two things. So it works a little bit differently, but I would say that outside of that, though, it is important to understand that Ball is still really easy to counter. It's hard for him to work against a lot of these support backlines that are just like impenetrable, like literally impenetrable, where they're playing a Brig, and especially like Brig Lifeweaver, like good luck doing anything. I mean, it's hard for all dives to do anything, but like, especially on ball, good luck making anything happen. I would say that for GM top 500, he's like bottom of C tier. For specifically average ranks of play, I'm actually going to bump him up to the bottom of B tier, specifically because he is independent. A lot of times the heal peel is not as consistent in the average ranks of play. And yeah, I'm going to put him there. He's a bit better when people aren't reacting to him properly. In the GM top 500, I'm putting him at the bottom of C tier right now. Now we're going to talk about Doomfist. Doomfist is actually surprisingly a really strong character right now. I know that the Doom community likes to complain a lot. I'm part of the Doom community, kind of, even though I have a lot of different opinions than most Doomfist players. Doomfist was really, really good in the Orisa meta. He's still good now. And the reason is, especially when you're having like these really slow, dirtily sustained fights, having a diver that can just exist, run away if they need to, but just exist. Like, yes, you're getting bullied. Yes, you're eating a ton of cooldowns, but as long as you're not pushing out, you're not dying. And you wait for your opportunity, and then you pivot on a dime, boom, out of nowhere. You're going in, you're kind of creating something, you're making something happen out of nowhere. You can do that. He's one of the few divers that can pivot that aggressively, that fast, and push people completely out of position, or just insta kill a backline, like insta delete a backline out of nowhere. Doomfist can do stuff like that. He can break things open in a way that other characters can't. Now, yeah, of course, there's characters that can counter you. They're frustrating. Yeah, of course, it's really hard to get value out of Doomfist if you have no one that's going to follow up with you. That's how it is with most tanks, but he still opens up the game in a way that other tanks can't do nearly as easily as Doomfist can. So if we're talking about it in that way, I do think that Doomfist is actually a really solid character, and yeah, especially if they like further, you know, maybe they tweaked him a little bit with his bugs, his quality of life, he would be a bit better. But I still think he's actually an A tier character when we're talking about Grandmaster top 500. He's actually an A tier character, low A tier, but still A tier. But for the average rank, I think he's a bit worse, mainly because he's a very hard character to play properly. And if you're not playing him properly, if you're dying too much, you could easily throw the game. I would probably put him somewhere in the lower B. I would probably put him there. I would say that that he's a fine character, even if you're not playing him perfectly in the lower tiers of play. People are not reacting to you in the way that they should be. But in the higher tiers of play, I think if you're really, really good with him, you can make him an A tier character in the right situations, of course. And it's better if you have a certain amount of follow-up coordination and things like that. You can definitely make him work. And yeah, I'm gonna put him in the low A tier for now. Now, next up, we do gotta talk about Reinhardt. And yeah, Reinhardt's just been having a rough go, like just a really rough go in general. Rein is not really favored in like any matchup right now. Like, there's very few matchups that I would ever want to be playing Rein in, unfortunately. And in addition to that, he's just a bit underpowered right now, mainly because of the power creep in the game. I mean, think about a lot of the characters that you would play against right now. Like, Orisa's just gonna spam you out, javelin you a million times. You're gonna get freaking spammed out by Torb. You're gonna get walled by Mei. I mean, there's just so many characters that you're just not really gonna get a lot of value on this character right now, unfortunately. I mean, there's just so many characters that Rein is just not gonna get a lot of value against right now, unfortunately. I would say that this is one of the few characters that I think has such a distinct difference between low elo and high elo that it's crazy. Because honestly, for high elo, so GM top 500, Reinhardt is deserving of like C tier. He's worse than Junkerqueen. Maybe he's even worse than Wrecking Ball, but it's pretty close. But if we're talking about high tiers, but if we're talking about average ranked play, he's actually an A tier character, which might seem really bizarre. But Rein is a character that really gets rewarded the more mistakes people are making. Like, people are not playing in the appropriate effective ranges. They're playing into Rein shadow. They're playing into Rein swings. And just generally, like, people know how to play around a Rein in low rank. Like, just the idea of like having a Reinhardt that's just pushing, people like follow you, like unlike other characters. So like, one of the biggest problems with D.Va, especially in lower ranks, is you will let an enemy tank walk in. Like, that's what you're supposed to do. So like, if I'm playing D.Va against a Rein, just hypothetically, really any tank, I'm not fighting them direct. The tank's walking in. I'm not challenging that tank. I'm not flying at that tank. I'm not challenging them directly. I'm letting that tank walk in and take a little bit of space because I can't fight that person directly. I'm a D.Va. I'm not supposed to fight that person directly. I'm supposed to contain the angles, and I'm supposed to look for opportunities. And sometimes I'll let that tank take space, push point, whatever, and I'll see an opportunity in their backline. I'll go in, swoop down, kill a support, fly back up, get that advantage, and then maybe I'll fight the tank after we secure that advantage. But I'm letting that tank take space. I'm letting that tank take all this space. But the problem comes in lower ranks. What do people always do? They walk into the tank and they die for no reason, right? Or they yell at you, D.Va, why are you letting this Rein get into our backline? Why are you letting this Rein on space? And it's like, you're doing what you're supposed to do, but people are losing their minds because they don't know how to play around it properly. That is why D.Va is fundamentally worse than like a Rein in lower ranks, because people understand how a Rein is supposed to play and they have no idea how a D.Va is supposed to play. And it's just more intuitive where people don't really understand the game that much. It's intuitive to follow a Rein. It's not intuitive to follow a diva. And that's one of the big disconnects that happens between low elo and high elo, and what shapes the meta and what is good at certain ranks. Now, this is wrapping up of the tank tier list so you can understand what big tanks and the metas that are forming right now in the current season. But let's move on to the DPS. Now, moving on to the DPS, we have several different changes and overarching changes to the meta that are changing where they're positioned, and we have a really rather big rework that we got to talk about as well in Sombra's rework. So there's a lot of changes we got to talk about, so let's break it down. First off, let's talk about Junkrat, and I would say that Junkrat is still a rather niche character, especially if we're talking about GM Top 500. For his GM Top 500 placement, I'm definitely putting him in C tier, primarily because I think there's only certain points on defense that he's effective in, that he's like viable in on certain areas. Yes, if you're a Junkrat god, you can make him work in more diverse ranges, but he's never going to be part of like an objective meta. He's going to be a niche character at best, and I do think that overall there are characters that are going to be easier to get value on, more consistently played, and just better fit with the existing characters in the meta. Now, I will say that if we're talking about the average rank, he's actually a B tier pick, primarily because you're going to get more value as like the mechanical ceiling decreases. More people are going to have harder times getting value at some of the high mechanically demanding characters, while Junkrat's value is going to stay a lot more grounded. So I'm going to put him in the B tier for the average rank, but still C tier for the GM Top 500 rank. Now, moving on to Torb. Torb is a character that I will put all the way in the A tier. Yes, Torb is still freaking so damn high in the meta. He's just one of the most consistent damage dealers in the game. He keeps characters, other divers like Tracer in check very, very well, and Sombras and other divers in general, and even Echoes. He can keep Echoes in check as well. He's really, really good in any of the poke / brawl compositions. So if the enemy is playing anything like Orisa, Sigma, Zarya, any of these like active spam fights that are happening, he's going to be just fine. You can even get value on him in more situations than just that. I think he's really, really solid overall. And this is both for GM Top 500 and average rank. I think I'm putting him at the top of A tier for both departments. That's just how consistent and strong he is. He's really kind of a menace right now, and he's been one for quite some time. So he definitely deserves that A tier. And then next up, we got to talk about Mei, and the developers just can't make up their mind with Mei. Like, they buff her and nerf her and take something away and add it back, and it's just like kind of like this endless cycle where Mei is just in a really weird position where no one really understands where she belongs. But there's a lot of things to like about Mei. I think especially because Mei is someone that her walls can get value in a way that pretty much no other character can. Her Blizzard is very, very consistent, and even her neutral is pretty good. The fact that you can Icicle very reliably and just like output a lot of damage, spamming head level. The fact that you are pretty beefy, right? You're not going to get one shot by a Hanzo. You have a form of heal on yourself. You're good against dive. You can one shot tracers. There's just a lot about you that makes you pretty good for the average rank, and there's more like complexity, strategic complexity that you can use at the higher ranks of play. I'm actually going to put her in the B tier, and I think that this applies for both GM Top 500 and the average rank as well for different reasons, but still very solid character, and a character that, while she's not always going to have the best fit, especially if you're playing any dive tank, she's not really going to fit very well there. She is always going to be able to find a way to get some value, or just be a character that is just really good at maintaining space, hard to kill, helps your tank in any situation where your tank is lacking, and I do think that she's just a solid character overall. Now, next up, we do got to talk about Soldier 76, and he's kind of in a spot where I think he's just fine. Like, there's nothing really wrong with him, but especially if we're talking about GM Top 500, there are typically better characters to play. I still think he's a very, very great character to play if you're up against like Echoes and Pharas. You could definitely play him if you have the aim. You could definitely just kind of shut those down, and he's fairly good at taking 1v1s with a lot of other divers as well in the right hands. But when we're thinking about like GM Top 500, I think it's more likely that you can get value out of something with a bit of a higher ceiling, I would say. So he kind of lags behind there. He brings like a more flat, consistent amount of value, but he doesn't really thrive, especially when we're talking about some of these more grindy compositions. He doesn't thrive nearly as much against like Orisas and Sigmas and Poke and Zaryas, just because of the way that he outputs damage. It's slow, and he doesn't actually work that well in most dive compositions outside maybe like a like a wrecking ball dive, right? Overall though, I think for GM top 500, I'd put him in the B tier, and for the average rank, I'd put him in the A. He still has great mobility. He's still independent. There's just a lot to like about him, and he's one of the characters that I always suggest for like new players coming into Overwatch for the first time, because you can learn Overwatch, you can learn the maps, you can learn other characters through a lens of, you know, relatability, right? He's very similar. He's the most similar to other games, so he's a great way to learn other aspects of the game when you're trying to learn Overwatch for the first time. So he's a great starter character, and he's honestly just really great in most low elos. He just kind of starts to fall off as you get up in elo towards the higher ranks of play. Next up, we do got to talk about Reaper. Reaper's been needing like a serious buff for quite some time. I do think that he's still pretty bad. Now, I will say that there are ways to get value out of him, especially like on Koth maps. There are some Koth maps that are actually pretty good with them. If you could set him up properly with like bubbles, or if you could set him up with speed boosts and other things, you can definitely pop off and carry with them in the right hands. I just don't necessarily think he's that consistent of a character, and he just has, you know, a lot of really easily exploitable weaknesses without enough good matchups. Overall, I would say that if he received like a really solid buff, he could get like a pretty substantial buff and not like break into the high tiers. I'm still gonna put him kind of like, I think he's actually about Junkrat status. I would say perhaps both of these characters deserve a B tier when we're talking about like the average rank to play. In fact, I would put Reaper up in the B tier for the average rank to play, but for GM top 500, I'm gonna say he deserves a C tier. So yeah. Next up, we got to talk about Bastion, and I will still loyally defend my position on Bastion being way easier to counter than people have been saying. Now, I understand like in the past he's had some problematic moments, right? And I still think that those exist, but I will say that there are legitimate ways to just completely shut down a Bastion. There are a ton of mobility characters that can shut him down. Flashpoint and Koth are terrible for Bastion. High ground maps like Nubani are terrible for Bastion. So you're already limited in the amount of maps that you could even play Bastion on. And I still think there's ways to counter him. Like, there's so much utility that you can do to shut him down. And you could say, oh, they're just going to Suzu him. They're just going to protect him. Like, if you can play the neutral or just like bait all these cooldowns out on the Bastion, you can just shut him down. He still has a giant hitbox. He's still super vulnerable when he's in turret form. If you're on the flank, you can play out of his line of sight. Like, there's just so many ways to play around a Bastion that I made an entire video on countering Bastion. He's not as good as people still think. I don't think he's like a problem or anything like that. He's really frustrating in the Orisa meta, but just like how I talked about Orisa having key weaknesses, so does Bastion. I would say for GM top 500, I would put him probably in like the B tier, but I do understand that when people don't play around him properly, don't know how to counter him. For the average rank, I could say, see, he's still in the A tier. So I'll put him average rank A, GM top 500 in high B, but still, he's a character that has a lot of weaknesses, a lot of things that you can exploit. So don't just allow this character to just run wild when there's so many ways to counter him from pretty much any role. Stop allowing it to happen. Stop playing into a Bastion. Most of the time, the only time a Bastion is getting a lot of value is when you're making a million mistakes into him. So please stop. The next up, we do gotta talk about Genji. And interesting thing about Genji is Genji's actually not bad. I know that this is like a weird situation where like Genji has felt underpowered for like many seasons, and then all of a sudden he started feeling okay, and you're like, wait, is Genji actually decent? Genji is actually decent. There's a lot of characters that he has decent matchups against. He's good against Zen. He's good against Ana. He's actually not that bad against Kiriko. A lot of tanks he's pretty good against. He's fine against characters like Diva. He's fine against Orisa. He's fine against Rein. Like, there's a lot of characters that Genji can play decent well against, and also there's a lot of just other DPS that he can just straight up just kind of body if you're good enough. Like, he's good against Hanzo, he's good against Widow, he's good against Sojourn, he's good against Ashe, like he's good against Cass. So there's a lot of situations where he's actually pretty decent. Oh, he's good against Bastion, of course. He's probably one of the better divers against Torb, even if Torb is still pretty annoying to deal with, but at least Genji can kind of threaten the turret and protect himself against it with deflect. Like, Genji is actually pretty good. Like, he's actually fine. Now, the problems with Genji are kind of the problems with a lot of other dive characters is there are certain characters that are just really annoying to deal with. Brig, freaking, you know, Torb, Brig, Mei, Suzu, just Suzu, not Kiriko as a whole, but Suzu in particular, and Lifeweaver is also just mad annoying, like crazy annoying. Now Genji is actually a little bit better against Lifeweaver compared to some of the other divers. Genji can follow him up vertically, but still, like, Lifeweaver is kind of a nightmare to deal with in a lot of ways, just being super beefy and also being able to pull and things like that. Definitely an annoying character to deal with. And Genji is just going to be better with the dive. Like, you're going to be able to get a ton of value with Genji if you're playing in a coordinated dive. If you're playing with an Orisa, a Sigma, or something that's just playing on the front line, it's going to be a lot harder for you to get value. Still, though, I think this character is actually pretty decent. I'm putting him in the B tier for the GM top 500 ranks of play, and I'm actually putting him in the A tier when we're talking about the average ranks of play. Genji feasts on people's mistakes. We know that his win rate goes up as people go lower in rank, and players are just not slower to react to, like, shut him down. I think especially, like, the person that takes it's easier to take the initiative in lower ranks than it is to be the reactive one that shuts things down. And you can see that in full force with Genji. So yeah, like average rank A, GM top 500, high B. The next character that we got to talk about is Cassidy, and Cassidy still sucks. Like, he's just not good. I'm sorry, but I know some of you really like Cassidy, and there are good parts about him. I mean, he's just, like, really hard to kill. Like, really hard to kill. He just gets to kind of just completely tank things with his role, but that's not what you needed out of a Cass. Like, right now, he's kind of a really good, like, if you're playing like this dirtily anti-dive exist composition, like with like a Lifeweaver and a Brig and like an Orisa and a freaking Cass, like, yeah, you're just not gonna be dope. Like, you're gonna shit on any dive, but you're just gonna lose to all this like long distance poke. You're gonna lose to Sojourns and Ashes and Hanzos. So Cassidy is okay, I think, as a role filler in certain situations, but most of the time he's just going to be kind of subpar. And honestly, I'm going to put him for GM top 500. I'm putting him C, high C. If we're talking about like the average rank, I'm going to put him low B tier. So remember, for average rank, this character is up here for average rank. This character is up here for average rank. This character is up here for average rank. So this is an average rank here. This is average right here. And this is the GM one. We can bring things back to reality. Now let's talk about Symmetra. Symmetra is still in a very weird situation post rework. There are pros and cons, and I think that she can be good in the right situation, but it's a little bit strange when and where that situation is. Overall, I would say most likely low B for both GM top 500 and the average rank. It's going to really depend on your individual skill on this character, and there are, of course, compositions where she's best in. I would say that she's worst playing in a dive composition, but you could be okay in a poke. She's probably best in a brawl, though, especially if you can come up with some creative ways to either assassinate people or apply pressure on the front line. There's a lot of varying playstyles with this character. Overall, though, I think a B tier is probably about right, and the fact that Orisa is still really good is definitely helping her just see more play. So yeah, I'm gonna put her in the B tier. I think that that's about solid. Now, next up, let's talk about Ashe. And Ashe is still just, like, one of the best characters, period. One of the strongest characters, and this goes both for average rank and GM top 500. She can consistently threaten divers. She's good with or without a pocket. She's very good at contesting flyers. She's good in poke compositions. She's good in brawl compositions. Maybe not the greatest in dive, but I think that she could be perfectly fine, and she has good mobility. Honestly, Ashe is just very, very strong. I'm putting her in the S tier for both GM top 500 and for just like the average ranks of play. Probably the strongest hit scan right now, and definitely one of the strongest characters just based on pick rate and win rate alone. I think I have to put her all the way up here. You could maybe justify her like high A, but I think that she's just objectively one of the strongest, most consistent characters across ranks. So I'm putting her all the way up here in the S tier. Now, Sojourn is a character that I kind of want to put in the same spot. She's very, very similar in that regard, where Sojourn is just very, very strong, very good neutral, good with the pocket, good without a pocket, good mobility. I think that Ashe and Sojourn are kind of two sides of the same coin, where they're both very, very strong, but you know, perhaps Ashe is a little bit easier to get value out of, and I do think that Ashe's ultimate is a little bit better as well. I'd probably put Sojourn top of A for GM top 500, but for the average rank, I'm actually going to put her top of B, so she goes down. While Ashe stays the same, I think Ashe has a very linear amount of like high value, no matter the rank. Sojourn definitely spikes at the higher ranks of play, and maybe it's S and B, but I'm gonna put her high A and B. I think that's about fair. Definitely let me know if you agree or disagree with me in the comments down below. And before we begin, I want to once again remind you that there's a new Halloween special, $15 off my private coaching. I've helped over 100 people get Grandmaster just in Overwatch 2, and in Overwatch 1, it's hundreds and hundreds of people I've helped improve. So if you want to climb, there's only 10 spots available, $15 off, so definitely go check out my private coaching in the links down below. Now, next up, let's talk about Tracer, and this is a character that kind of inspired me to separate GM Top 500 and average rank, because this was the character that was always like the most divisive, right? Because I always put Tracer in the high tiers when it didn't always feel fair. It was like, oh yeah, you're putting Tracer in S tier, but like for the vast majority of people, they're not able to play Tracer like that. So like it's just like a stupid place to put her for everybody, and these tier lists are supposed to be for everybody. So if we're talking about the average ranks, right, the average ranks, I actually think that for the average ranks, she's like in true like B tier, like here. And remember, Genji and Soldier are up in the A tier for average ranks, while she's like right around here. For average rank play, Tracer's good, but there's a lot of really annoying things. There's a million things that can one-shot you from every role. There's things that just can shut you down for free, like Brig and Torb. It's a very annoying world, but you can still make it work on Tracer. You have a lot of high up time. There's ways to get a lot of value on the character. You're really good in dive, blah, blah, blah. There's a lot of things that work with the character, but there's a lot of things that shut you down that are really annoying to deal with. Now, once you start to get better and better and better, you can play around those things. And that's why when we're talking about GM Top 500, Tracer is still top of A or S. I think I could easily just justify Tracer in the S tier at GM Top 500. Yes, there's a lot of annoying things to play around still, but you have the means to play around them. And especially if you're playing in any dive, Tracer can kind of be the GOAT. In ranked play, Tracer can be the GOAT in the right hands. GM Top 500, I think she still deserves that S tier slot. One of the strongest characters in the game for sure, and a character that can warp the entire meta around her. So yeah, B tier for average rank, but GM Top 500, we're going S tier. Now let's move on to Widowmaker. Widowmaker is still suffering quite a bit from the one-shot range nerf, and especially if we're talking about, you know, players in the average rank, this character is not a character that I would really recommend that much. I'm actually putting her very low. Not only is she just mechanically hard to get value out of, but you're not even guaranteed to get the value out of all that work, or maybe that inconsistency. You shoot 10 times, you hit one, it's supposed to be worth all the attempts, and it doesn't kill, right? It's not very reliable. There's so many things that can shut you down, so many divers. Hanzo, it feels like a character that can just completely dominate you for less skill. But when we talk about players in the GM Top 500 level, I think you could accelerate her up to probably about like mid to high B, because there are situations where the Widowmakers know that they can get value with her. There are maps that are actually still really good with her. And realistically, if you had an aggressive Widowmaker style already, you're going to get about the same amount of value as you did before. And that style still exists. I'm still going to make it clear that you need the skill already to make her work, or you need to earn that skill. So she's not an easy character to play, and she's not really a character I would recommend grinding if you want to get good at a character. But if you have the skill already, if you know how to play her in GM Top 500, you could definitely make her work in certain situations. And in those situations, she could feel oppressive still. So I'm putting her at the top of B tier. Now, speaking of oppressive, we got to talk about Hanzo. Hanzo is like still one of the best DPS. Like, he has been. I'm actually just putting Hanzo in the freaking S tier. He's just that good. Like, pretty much outside of dive, you can't really play him in dive, right? But in poke and brawl, Hanzo's insane. He just gets to one-shot things. He gets to provide tons of pressure. He gets to be amazing in the neutral. When the Orisas want to do the thing where they just sit around and trade abilities and damage, right? Two Orisas just sitting into each other, Voltroning it up. Hanzo gets just to sit there, take shots, and eventually kill something and just win the fight for his team. But in other situations, Hanzo can just take duels with people, get information, can shut down divers by hitting headshots. Like, there's just so much about Hanzo that's just so good. And he's kind of maintained this powerful position for a long enough time that he definitely justifies his S tier slot. And I would say that he is most likely an A tier character for the average rank and the S tier character for the GM Top 500. And the only reason there's that distinction is, even though that Hanzo gets like this rap that it's just like no brain, just spam, right? The reality of it is, like, you need to be mechanically decent at Hanzo to get value out of him. And I know this because I've coached a lot of Hanzo players that they aren't able to mechanically hit the shots they need to to get enough value on a fast enough time frame as opposed to some other characters. Like, if you're not good enough on Hanzo mechanically, you're not consistent on Hanzo enough mechanically, there's other characters you could get way more value on at the lower tiers of play, like Torb, for instance. But if you are reaching those mechanical thresholds, that mechanical consistency, all of a sudden the doors are open for you on Hanzo. He gets that certain amount of free value, but I'm talking about the more reliable, consistent amounts of value. So yeah, for average rank, putting him in low A. For GM top 500, he's an S tier character. Now, let's talk about Sombra. And this is the one that a lot of people are going to be curious about. Where does Sombra place? And in a lot of ways, especially when we talk about GM top 500, I played her 10 games in GM top 500. I'm having an entire video coming out pretty soon that you're going to want to see, where we break that down and I record everything, and it's going to be a really cool piece. We're working really hard on it. But Sombra is a character that has what I would say a lot of the same strengths and weaknesses as Genji, like the same problems and the same like frustrating moments as like a character like Genji. And what I mean by that is, in a full dive, when you have a team that is committing to a dive, Sombra feels great, like really, really great. But when you're playing against an enemy team that has a lot of these characters that can either threaten you from range, pocketed DPS, or support lineups that are just really hard to break through, like Brig, Lifeweaver, and you don't have any sort of coordinated dive, she feels unplayable. So there are situations where she's decent in, and the situations where she's unplayable in, and that's kind of how Genji feels. So I'm actually going to put her like right around there. Like, that's kind of where she is. I think she's actually really good in the right situations, but she's not going to be a character that can play very well against some of these like these anti-dive comps in the same way that I think old Sombra could. And the reason that old Sombra could is because you didn't really have to go out and just commit to a dive and kill things. You could just farm, and then just EMP and get the value out of there. New Sombra needs to commit a lot more, and that means that she wants people committing with her. She doesn't want to be the only one to commit, right? So that's why she's still here. And I would say that she's probably about the same in the average ranks to play, although she is a bit hard to play. I would say you would probably put her, you know, maybe at the bottom of B tier instead of like, you know, mid in the low ranks to play. But I also keep in mind that Genji's higher and Soldier's higher. So like, she's in B tier when these characters are higher in the average ranks of play. I do think that she's one of the best characters if you're like smurfing or something like that. Like, she has some crazy skill ceiling potential if you're great at her. But for the average player in the average rank, I think she's B tier. And for GM top 500, I think she's also B tier. So yeah, next up, let's talk about Echo. And Echo is still like a really strong character. I'm putting her in A tier for GM top 500. She's actually going to be getting B tier probably around here for the average rank. But yeah, GM top 500, she's going to be quite a bit higher at A tier. And the reason that Echo is just so good is she doesn't need a pocket to get value. There's ways to play her, like you can play her in different ways. You can play her in like an all-in dive if you have a dive team. You can play her as an off-angling poker if you don't have a dive. You don't have anyone that can commit with you. So like, that's kind of the difference between like, if we look at Echo, right, who's obviously a character that can play well in dive, right? Just the same as like a Genji or a Sombra can. But think about the other playstyles. Like, what does Sombra and Genji do if they can't dive? Like, if they can't ever dive? Their neutral is terrible. Like, you're not going to just be like poking from range with your SMG or poking from range with your shuriken and just being like a blade bot. I mean, you can, but it's not that great compared to Echo, who can do it all by themselves, can poke from range, can actually threaten to dive, but at the same time just play a really solid neutral game with the potential to just like burst a tank that's too low or whatever the case may be with beam. And then you have an ultimate that is just a really, really solid ultimate like by itself. And yeah, I'm gonna put her here. She's also really good on the high ground oriented maps and things like that. So yeah, she deserves here in GM top 500. But even though like, so like, just so you understand, for average rank, she's down here, but Genji's up here. So I think in the average ranks of play, Echo's worse than Genji, but in the higher ranks of play, Echo becomes better than Genji on average. Now, last but certainly not least, we got to talk about Phara. And Phara is another decisive. Now, last but certainly not least, we got to talk about Phara. And Phara is a character that, especially on certain maps with the Mercy Pocket, she can be dominant. But for the most part, she's going to have ways to counter her. She's not going to be that reliable or consistent. There are some maps that are just not favored for her. I think that especially when we get to like GM top 500 levels of aim, most people can kind of shut her down on most maps, even though there are some maps that are still really frustrating for her, some COD maps in particular. But if I talk about specifically like GM top 500, I would say that she's niche enough and she's like specific enough that she's like a low B tier pick. But if we're talking about average rank, she skyrockets up to like a high B tier pick. Like, she really can dominate some average SR lobbies because people just don't have the aim to shut her down. Phara Mercy is a really easy combo to just set up and get some free value with. And if we're talking about console, it becomes even worse in like the average elo. So yeah, maybe in console she's like A, right? But yeah, she gets worse as people climb in rank. Of course, there are some Pharas out there that are just like demons, but there are also other players that know how to shut her down. There's certain tanks that you can play like D.Va that can shut her down. So there are ways to shut her down effectively, and you are committing 2 people to the 1 combo, which costs more when people know how to properly, you know, kind of exploit that gap on the other support that is left behind, more or less. So overall, this is the Season 7 DPS tier list, and note that I made the distinction between GM top 500 and average rank, but definitely let me know if you agree or disagree with any of these, and we're going to move on to the most important role right now in the current meta, the support role. So let's break it down. Then last but certainly not least, we do got to talk about the support. And support is the most divisive role right now because a lot of people are talking about their power level, and we are going to get in exactly what supports are the most powerful that you could abuse right now to climb the most, and the supports that you should probably avoid. So let's break it all down, starting off with Bap. And Bap has a lot going for him, right? Especially if we're talking about a lot of the brawl tanks that are seeing play. Orisa, Zarya, characters like that. Bap is just really, really great, and he's also good in a poke composition, playing with a character like Sigma. There's really just the only composition that I would not recommend playing him in is specifically dive. So if you're, you know, rocking a Doom, rocking a Winston, rocking a D.Va, he's probably not the best thing for you to play. But anything outside of that, I think he's perfectly viable and reasonable. And for the most part, I would say for the lower tiers of play, or the average tiers of play, he's even better. He just has so much utility that you need to get through. He has so much consistent damage, so much consistent heals. So if we're talking about him in this tier list, I would say for the average rank, he's actually an S tier pick. That's pretty crazy, but he is an S tier pick just because of how powerful his utility is. But if we're talking about specifically for the GM top 500s, I'm actually going to put him at the top of B. And you might be curious why I'm putting him so much lower. It's mainly because there's a lot of supports that bring a crazy amount of value right now. Like, it's really competitive because there's just so many different options, and I can't just stack everything in the A and S tier. So yeah, top of B. His intrinsic value, I would say, falls off a little bit when people become more consistent at, you know, capitalizing on everything some of the other supports are capable of. But still, for the average ranks of play, I would say anything like underneath the Masters rank, he's like an S tier pick. So keep that in mind. Next up, we do got to talk about Lifeweaver. And yeah, Lifeweaver is just the best heal botter in the game. Just by far the best heal botter in the game. Really, really hard to kill. Shut down dives. Very good against like any dive composition, period. Honestly, fairly good in the brawls as well. There's just a lot to love about Lifeweaver, just as like this like unstoppable support that just makes a team unkillable. And especially if we're talking about a lot of the average ranks of play, I think that Lifeweaver becomes even better. You just get so much automatic value. You just become so hard. You know, you're really hard to kill. You're really hard. You make tanks really hard to kill. You can bail people out of situations. So for the average ranks of play, I'm actually putting Lifeweaver all the way in the A tier. That seems a bit crazy, but I think that you can really heal bot your way to having crazy high impact without necessarily needing to be able to, like, I don't know, hit every shot or shoot things or be like a DPS support like most supports have to be. And if you are someone that is very linear in the supports you play, so like if you're a Mercy one trick or like a Lucio one trick or something like that, put Lifeweaver in your hero pool. Add Lifeweaver in. There's going to be situations where Lifeweaver is an amazing pick to play, and it doesn't really take that long to learn how to play and be comfortable with Lifeweaver. And the situations that you're going to be able to whip him out in is just going to be amazing. Like, there's going to be so many games you're just going to win you're gonna literally hard carry your team just by swapping to Lifeweaver. So yeah, I would highly suggest adding Lifeweaver to your hero pool. It's a really easy swap to do, and it better insulates your overall, you know, matchup. So yeah, but for the average player, while I will put them in the A tier, I'm putting them down in like the bottom of B tier for GM Top 500. There are more ways to exploit a Lifeweaver, and I think kind of similar to the Baptiste example, the neutral, like the ceiling that you can get at a Lifeweaver's neutral becomes less and less as what you can replace that with becomes better as people get better. So like characters like Ana, Kiriko, you know, Illari, these characters become better and better as the skill of people get better, and Lifeweaver just doesn't compete with that as much anymore as you get to the higher and higher ranks. So yeah, Lifeweaver falls down a bit. Still good though, still very good. Baptiste is still good as well, still a really solid character, and still something you can swap to in the right situations. Now Moira. So this is a character that I actually think is fine even in GM Top 500. I'm gonna put them in the B tier, GM Top 500. And the reason that you can play Moira in GM Top 500, you're only playing her in one composition, and it's dive. Mainly, that's all you're doing. If you're playing her in a different composition, you're probably, you know, not doing that much, unfortunately. And the reason that you can play her in dive is that she can dive. Like, she legitimately just dives with a DPS. So if I'm playing a Genji or a Sombra or a Tracer, I love it when I have a DPS in Moira, because my Moira and I jump in Ana simultaneously. We kill them instantly, like literally instantly, and then we can go dive someone else. They can heal me up. We go dive someone else. We kill them too. We're just gonna kill the whole team, and you can do that a lot with Moira, where that is the way that you get the full value out of Moira, is by doing that. And that's really what you should be doing if you're playing Moira in high rank. In a dive, you can definitely dive with your team, and that's kind of how you should be playing her. But when we're talking about the average rank, Moira shoots all the way up to S. And the reason that Moira shoots all the way up to S is because she gets to just do a little bit of everything and just, you know, win every 1v1, output a ton of healing, output a ton of damage, and you're getting a ton of value on the character. Especially if we're talking about like gold, silver, bronze, Moira becomes kind of like this unstoppable monster that is more scary to deal with than most DPS, because at least you run into like a Hanzo and he's probably gonna miss, but you run into a Moira, she's not. She's gonna just kill you. So yeah, very strong character in the lower ranks of play, and you can kind of just DPS like a lot and just be like almost a better DPS than most DPSs. That also gets mobility, that also gets self-heal, that also can heal up your tank. Like, you get all these other extra things, but all those things kind of fall out the race side after people get better and understand how to shut you down and have better mechanical skill, even though you could still get value out of her in the situation. So like, if you couldn't play her in anything in the high ranks of play, she would be C, but you can play her in dive in the high ranks of play, so she's gonna be B. But S for the average ranks of play. Now, next up, we do got to talk about Ana. Ana's just phenomenal at both average and GM Top 500. Ana's an S tier, and this comes down to a lot of reasons, and it's pretty much gonna be like this in ranked probably forever. One, Ana's the most picked character out of every character in the entire game. Ana's the most picked. That just means that, like, if we're thinking about what characters you're gonna run into or have on your team, you're most likely gonna have an Ana, no matter what. That's just true. You're just always gonna have an Ana. There's always gonna be an Ana. You need to know how to play against her, or you need to know how to play with her if you're not playing her, no matter what, even if you're not playing Ana. But the reason that Ana's so strong is because of the one tank paradigm. Being able to just nade tanks is just a crazy amount of value. Like Junkerqueen walking forward, getting naded is just one of the easiest ways to just completely shut them down. Nade can just kind of bully a ton of tanks very, very easily. Sleep Dart is still one of the most powerful cooldowns, period. Nano's still one of the most powerful things to combine with. Ana can heal very fast. Ana can DPS very fast. So you have all this powerful utility, a powerful ultimate, powerful neutral, powerful heals. Like, what's weak about you? You don't have mobility. That's the only weakness about you. But it's almost like there are characters that your team can play that can just perma protect you, like, you know, Brig or even Kiriko could just Suzu you, or, you know, you could have other characters that just pocket you, or you could have DPS that are looking out for you. You could have tanks that help you. And even if all those things fail, you have the means to take things into your own hands. You could nade someone, sleep someone, shoot someone, duel someone, position well. Like, there's just so much counterplay that you have to Ana, where in ranked play, I don't imagine Ana will be dethroned from this S tier spot. She's just one of the best characters to play. She has consistently high impact. And I'm not saying that she doesn't have ways to shut her down or outplay her, but when she is doing what she's supposed to do, when she's doing everything right, she just feels like she has some of the highest impact out of anyone on the battlefield, period. So I'm putting her in the S tier. And I'm keeping her in the S tier even for average rank play as well, because even though people are not doing all those things correctly, Ana just brings so much consistent value to the table, you know, just using her abilities in like the obvious ways, that I have to put her all the way up here. Next up, I gotta talk about Kiriko. And Kiriko, I'm actually putting S tier for GM top 500, but lower than here. I'm putting her for like B. I could maybe even justify high C, but I'm gonna put her low B for average rank. And the reason that I'm doing that is because Kiriko actually has a really low win rate in the low ranks of play, like very low. She doesn't even have that great of a win rate in GM top 500, but it's much higher than it is in the average ranks of play. And it comes down to the fact that you need mechanical excellence and you need to understand how you're supposed to be playing Kiriko to get the full value out of her. Both of the things need to be true. So like the thing that I always teach on Kiriko is you need to understand how to take these off angles and push these off angles and apply pressure from these off angles and be able to balance, you know, being that support, but also being like a pseudo damage dealer that can get value just doing damage. You need to be able to balance those things, but just knowing that is half the battle, where a lot of Kirikos don't even know that. They don't even play like that. But then you still need mechanical excellence to make that work. So it requires not only knowledge, but mechanical skill combined to get the value on the character that really makes her broken. It means that for most players, they're just leaving a ton of value on the table and the character is just not broken in their hands. So when we consider all those things, she's like a low B tier character for the average rank, but when we consider what she's capable of, whether it's teleporting in to help a DPS control an off angle, or teleporting in with a dive, or saving someone from an ultimate, or dueling and just applying a ton of pressure, like there's just so much you could do on the character when you're reaching closer to her skill ceiling. She deserves an S tier for GM top 500, but for the average rank, not so much. The next up, we do got to talk about Brig. And Brig is another interesting situation where I think that Brig is an A tier character for average rank. So she's really, really strong. And I'm putting her in B tier for GM top 500. So the thing about Brig that's super, super strong in just average rank is most people are always going to come into your effective range. Most people are going to have a really hard time just dealing with your automatic inspire, your shield, your pressure. Like they're just going to have a lot of time, like a really hard time bursting through you. Like there's a lot of characters that they can't mechanically threaten you even if a better version of them could. So like as an example, if I'm Genji, right, I'm not really that afraid of Brigs, especially in a 1v1. Like I'll just dash through them. I'll either break their shield and kill them, or dash through them 180, right-click melee, and just kill them. Like, I'll just straight up kill them. But, like, most Genjis are not going to be able to do that consistently enough to threaten you. Same thing with Tracers. Like, your existence alone is, like, warding off, like, a lot of people. So, like, in the average rank, you're going to get all that value. Now, you're still going to get a lot of value at a Brig in the higher ranks of play, but it's more specific, and there's certain matchups that are really bad for you. There's certain things that you just feel like you can't do anything against, like a long distance hit scan or a flyer or certain things like that. So there are certain situations where you kind of shine, and there's certain situations where you don't shine as much in GM top 500. But when we talk about low elo or average elo, even when they're playing the characters that are supposed to be advantaged against you, they don't play them in the way to specifically play to their strengths and to your weaknesses. They don't identify those things nearly enough. They oftentimes just play into you, and you're always going to get value in one way or another. Most of the time. This is not always true, but it is most of the time. So I'm going to say A tier, average rank, high B when we're talking about GM top 500. So yeah, still a very solid character. One of the greatest characters to play when the enemy is playing any dive. You can kind of just shut it down, especially if you and the other support are like on each other's toes, right? Playing Lifeweaver, playing Ana, whatever the case may be. You can really just protect each other and keep each other alive. But let's move on to Zenyatta. And Zenyatta is a character that I think is being a little bit slept on. Like a little bit slept on. Like he's still a very, very solid character at outputting a ton of freaking damage. You're still going to be able to focus things. You're still going to be able to kill things. And for both GM top 500 and average rank, I'm actually putting him in the A tier. And this might be my most controversial pick, but he just has a ton of like ways to just output a crazy amount, especially for the average rank. The fact that you are already a character that is just dueling a lot, doing a lot of DPS and healing at the same time is already putting you in the right direction. Because that's one of the biggest things that when I coach supports in low ranks of play, kind of across the board, and I've coached a lot of them in the past couple seasons, most supports just don't do enough damage. Like they're not doing enough outside of healing. Like they're focusing way too much on that heals per 10, and not enough for like winning the freaking game. They're not doing anything else. Zenyatta's already putting you in the right mindset, on the right path, where you're just gonna win more games just because you're doing the general right thing that supports are supposed to do, right? But when we talk about like the higher ranks of play, Zenyatta can really become opened up when people are properly focusing the Discord, people are really applying pressure towards what you Discord, and yeah, there's certainly going to be situations where you get like completely shit on by divers, but I think having Zen in your back pocket, there's like a slow poke fest with a Sigma or an Orisa or a Ramattra or whatever the case may be, boom, you're Zen. They go dive, boom, you're a Lifeweaver, or boom, you're Brig. Like, you can do that and just get a crazy amount of value on the character. Not to mention, like, good Zens know that you can just shit on some divers, especially if they're not, like, 3-man coordinated rushing you. Like, you could definitely just body them. And, yeah, I think he's just a little bit of an underrated pick right now. Still a really solid pick, and I'm putting him in the A tier. And I'm putting him in that way for both low rank, or average rank, and GM Top 500. Now, let's talk about Mercy. Mercy's in an interesting situation because for GM Top 500, there are definitely ways to counter her, but the thing about it is the people that you are enabling are even better at getting value. So like GM Top 500, I'm actually gonna put her about the same as Lifeweaver. I would say that GM Top 500 about the same because you can enable people that are really, really good. You know what you're doing on the character, so you know who to pocket, who to enable. Reses are just very, very valuable when picks are harder to get, and like pocketed Ashes are still really good, pocketed Soldiers, pocketed Sojourns. Like, there's still a lot of ways to get a crazy amount of value on this character. But if we're talking about the average rank of play, skyrockets to A tier. And the reason that Mercy is so good in the average ranks of play is mainly because the fact that you get this automatic synergy. So one of the things that's so strong, and I've made an entire video on this topic, is when Kiriko gets to teleport to anybody and help people on a dime, that synergy is super powerful. Like, if the enemy has a Kiriko on their team, and every time I challenge like an enemy soldier on an off angle, their Kiriko teleports to their soldier, heals him, and then fights me with him, right? So he's like instant 2v1, and I'm fighting me. That's hard to set up because the Kiriko has to be really aware and on point with when and where they time their engagements. But if they do, it becomes really, really hard to deal with, right? The Mercy synergy is just automatic. It happens. And the thing that happens when you combine two people's value is it's an exponential increase. It's not like 5 plus 5 is 10. It's like 5 times 5, and it becomes way more difficult. And any DPS can tell you that this is true. Any DPS can tell you that dealing with a pocketed DPS is one of the most frustrating experiences ever because it feels like you cannot deal with them. Like, you just can't. You just feel like you're getting bodied every time you try. And that's what Mercy can create. And it's not hard to create that in the average rank. Like, you just attach yourself to the best DPS in the lobby, and boom, you're already like this amplified force that is just so hard for people to deal with. So, yeah, Mercy's an A-tier character for the average ranks of play, but in GM Top 500, I would say that she's like mid-B. Notice how a lot of characters are in this B tier. It's because all of them are good, but they're situationally good. They're not universally good, right? The ones that are universally good are at the top. These ones are more situationally good, and that's why they're towards here. Still good, though. It's just situational. Yeah, let's talk about Lucio. And, oh, man, this is a tricky one. This is another one that might be a little controversial. For GM Top 500, I'm going to put Lucio in A. Just how much you enable, whether with the speed boost, with the coordination, you're enabling Zaryas, you're enabling just brawl compositions. Even in like poke battles, you can definitely like boop a Sigma out of position and things like that. And in dive, you're just like amazing, right? So there's a lot to love about him in a lot of those situations. He might even be above Zenyatta in GM Top 500. I think that is probably fair to say. So yeah, GM Top 500, I'll probably put him in. Very, very solid character with that coordination. Now, without that coordination in place, I think Lucio is one of the worst supports in the game. So like in average rank, I think that Lucio is one of the worst supports in the game. He's still fine, C tier, not F. He's still fine. People are not utilizing your abilities the way that they should. No one times their engagements around your beat. No one uses your speed boost. No one understands the macro strategy enough to utilize what Lucio is providing them, right? And that requires you to just kind of be like this DPS Lucio, which if you're going to be a DPS Lucio, I think there's just other characters that you can play that just do that better. Not to say that you can't climb that way, but if you were to argue with me that Illari is a worse character to just DPS with than Lucio, you'd be crazy, right? the thing about it is, in lower elo, you're kind of forced to play a style that doesn't really play to the real strengths of Lucio, and that's why in the lower elos, in the average ranks of play, I think Lucio is probably the worst support, but in the GM top 500 ranks of play, I think he's actually fairly solid. Now, last but certainly not least, we have Illari, and I would say for both GM, top 500, and average ranks of play, I'm putting Illari in the A tier for different reasons, but also the same. So like, one, Illari has high burst damage, which, as we found out, burst damage is crazy strong. And it's one of the reasons why Illari's primary fire is better than Baptiste, or it plays out better than Baptiste most of the time, because it turns out doing high amounts of burst damage in one shot is better than doing, you know, a smattering of damage in 3 shots and not as fast and not as consistent, right? In addition to that, like, Illari gets this, like, burst heal on her alternate fire, and she gets consistent heal with her turret that doesn't require you to aim, and you can do a lot of things at once. You can damage and heal at the same time. You also have a DPS ult, basically, that is really, really strong and really reliable at turning fights if you're good with it. So, like, Illari brings a lot to the table. She gets to do a lot of damage. She gets to provide a lot of sustain. She gets to help her team. She gets to burst from range, and she's good in a lot of different compositions, whether it's brawl, whether it's poke. She's very, very strong. She can be played in dive as well, and she can follow up from range. I think that there's enough about her that makes her good in enough situations that she deserves that A tier. And I would say that she deserves that A tier both for the average ranks of play and GM top 500 play. So yeah, she's definitely a hard character to play and learn, but I think she's worth it. And even if you're not hitting every single headshot, you're still getting a lot of value out of her kit. And overall, I would say that this is the tier list that I have right here for GM top 500. And for specifically, if we're talking about the tier list that we would make if it is average ranks of play, things move like this, like that. Anyways, this is my ultimate tier list that has every single hero. And if you enjoyed this piece of content where we put it all together and we time-stamped it all, do me a solid and press that like, subscribe, and make sure that you check out my private coaching. There are only 10 slots available, $15 off for the Halloween special, and one person is going to have the chance to become part of my unranked to GM coaching series that I'm going to be doing on this channel. So if you want to get involved, if you want to improve, I've helped over 100 people get to Grandmaster, and you can be next. So check it out right now in the links down below. Thank you so much for coming by. Hope you enjoyed the video, and we'll see you next time, baby. Peace.